So most welcome to Stockholm University and this lecture by Keith Devlin. Stockholm University and its Department of Education and Department of Mathematics and Natural Science Education who arranged this special opportunity. We are very happy to have you here. If I should properly introduce Keith, it would take the whole time, so I just say a few lines. Englishman, lives in the States, works at Stanford, but affiliated to very many universities, called the math guy in the American radio, and also the co-founder of HSTAR, Human Science Technology Development Unit. Yeah. He has written rather much, more than 80 research articles and more than 30 books. And I was looking at one of the books here, Mathematics Education for a New Era, Video Games as a Medium for Learning. And he writes rather provoking lines like, we are too much obsessed with basic skills. And it started me to think. So I'm very curious and I'm very happy to have you here. Most welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here, and good morning, everyone. So, we're really just at the beginning of understanding how to use video games in mathematics learning. You will notice, by the way, I'm going to keep using the phrase mathematics learning. I'm not going to use the phrase mathematics teaching very much, because I think, certainly in mathematics, if not most disciplines, what people do is they learn, and what we teachers can do is help them to learn. And video games provide an opportunity. Actually, it's an ideal medium for helping students to learn mathematics. One of the provocative things I wrote in that book on video games was that if Euclid had had video games available in 350 BCE, he would have produced a video game as the primary vehicle, and his famous book Elements would have been a support manual for the video game. Because if you read Euclid's Elements, he's describing how to do things. You draw triangles, you drop perpendiculars. It's all about action. Well, books are not about action. Books are static. Video games are about action. So if you're talking about something that has to be done, a dynamic medium is more ideal than a static medium, and video games are a dynamic medium. And I'm going to be focusing on this collection of disciplines, everyday mathematics. Some would say this is not just mathematics, this is everyday life skills. I would say that. These are everyday life skills. These are the kind of things that everyone needs to know to live a productive life in the 21st century. It's equivalent to being able to read and write. Most of this does not require paper and pencil or calculation. It's just the kind of cognitive apparatus we need to survive and do well in modern life. It's sometimes just referred to as numeracy or quantitative literacy, and it's numerical, estimation, logical, analytic reasoning skills. It's the kind of skills that actually are the basis for living in a society where the career you're going to be pursuing 4 or 5 years' time has not yet been invented. My own view about education is the most important thing we do when we graduate our students is that the goal we should seek is that they can think for themselves and can continually learn new things. So the main goal, from my perspective of education, is learning how to learn. And once you adopt that principle, what you learn is much less important. So these are the areas I'm going to be looking at. It's roughly in terms of mathematics, it's the mathematics that we learn in the middle school levels, ages 10 through 14, that sort of an age group. But as I said, it's really not, calling it mathematics is a little bit specialized. It's rather different from most mathematics. So most mathematics, you need to write symbols down to do it. Most mathematics, until you start writing symbols down, you haven't even defined the objects you're going to deal with. But this is the mathematics where you're talking about things in the world. And when you do write symbols, those symbols simply refer to things in the world. They're not really, they're just an abstraction from the world. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. And in terms of video games, this is actually the domain that's most interesting to develop. Developing video games, I've been looking at this since 2003, almost 10 years now I've been looking at this, both in universities and with video game professionals. And during that time, we've seen quite a lot of video games come out for elementary education. It's not easy to do it well, but it's a fairly obvious way to go about it. Using video games in high school and beyond, there are fairly obvious things to do. But the middle school is the sweet spot, where it's an interesting challenge, but it's also, I think, where video games can have the biggest impact. Okay. This is the book that Stefan mentioned, came out exactly a year ago now. It's a book about pedagogy. It's written to be very understandable. I don't use a lot of complicated language. I wanted this to be read by game designers, by students, by teachers at large, but it was aimed, as the cover indicates, although it's about video games, it's really aimed at people interested in teaching and learning. It's not a how-to manual for designing a video game. Okay. And because it's such a new domain, this actually is the first and only book so far that does this. And so if you're interested in things I say, that will provide a lot of the background towards things I'm going to be saying. Okay, the three sources, there are many sources, but three sources in particular stand out that I drew upon to write this book. First, there was the main book on mathematics pedagogy at the school level, K through 12 education in the United States, was produced by the National Research Council in 2000, overseen by the Mathematical Sciences Education Board, which I was a member of at the time. It was a distinguished panel of experts, both in mathematics and mathematics education, was assembled and spent many years writing this book, this report that became published as a book, Adding It Up. So Adding It Up, helping children learn mathematics, is one of the main sources. It really is, to my mind, an extremely good resource for mathematics education. The second book I drew upon was by James Paul Gee, the first academic who made a serious study of video games, and he produced this very provocative but deep, insightful book called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. And his point was this new domain of video games, because of the way it developed, we as educators can learn a lot from there. Because Gee makes a couple of points that we need to bear in mind. There is no such thing as a non-educational video game. In a video game, you do something very simple. You're given some information, you're given an opportunity to reflect on that information, either physically reflect or cognitively reflect, and then you're tested to see whether you know it. And you're put into a learning, practice, testing cycle over and over again, and you're learning something. In fact, the reason people get addicted is because as you're learning, we know we get dopamine released in the brain, a little amount of this thing which makes us feel good because we've learned something new, we've progressed. For purely commercial reasons, the video game designers quickly use that technology so that we're constantly kept at the limits of our competence and we're learning just enough to feel good. And that means we're learning at an optimal rate. Now, they did that for entertainment purposes to keep people playing. But that's what we'd love to have in education. The thing we struggle with is keeping the students interested and engaged and moving forward. And one of the reasons video games can do this well is because a video game is not speaking to 20 or 30 students. A video game is basically interacting with one student. And the pace of the interaction is dictated by that student. So it's very, very personalized interaction, and it's built upon learning. So every video game is about learning. And of course, the question is, what are you learning? Are you learning to kill monsters or steal automobiles, or are you learning some mathematics? Well, it turns out to be easier to build a game in which people learn how to steal automobiles or kill monsters than to build games in which you learn mathematics, but learning mathematics can be done. And James Paul Gee, in his book, by the way, he's a cognitive scientist by training, he goes into some detail as to how video games achieve their goal of providing engaging entertainment and how that amounts to learning. In fact, he enumerates something like 36 or more principles of learning which video game designers instinctively, not explicitly, but instinctively built into their designs. The third book I draw upon is a book that came out in the early 1990s called Street Mathematics and School Mathematics. Then that's a book about how people learn mathematics in a real context. Take those three books, blend them together, and my book comes out of that. So those are the three main sources I drew upon, and during the course of the next few minutes I'll actually make reference to all of those three sources. Okay, let me begin though with the adding it up, the National Research Council manual. They they split mathematics, they gave 5 goals for mathematics education, but they were very explicit to say that those goals form an intertwined whole. This is not a matrix where you check the boxes. This is an integrated whole. They were very explicit that you're not supposed to do one on Monday and another one on Tuesday. You're doing them all of the time. But those are the 5 things they listed. Conceptual understanding, and then they elaborate them. These are their words, not mine. Conceptual understanding, procedural fluency. Now that's the stuff that most parents want their kids to achieve. Being able to do their arithmetic and to know their number bonds and all of that kind of stuff, which is a little bit out of date. You know, we carry machines around in our pockets that can do that in a heartbeat. So the days when we needed to be able to accurately compute are long gone. On the other hand, if you've got a powerful little device in your pocket, you need to know what it's capable of and what its limitations are. So you really need a higher level understanding. But there's the procedural fluency, and you certainly, I should say right now, since I'm going to be focusing on deeper conceptual issues, not to say that those basic skills are not important. They're part of the package. You need them. You know, these are the NRC were clear. This is one of the 5. They're not saying it's irrelevant. They're saying it's one of 5 equally important components. Strategic competence, linking between the real world and mathematics, taking a real world problem, expressing it mathematically and leading it back to the real world. Being able to think about the world using mathematics along with other thinking skills, other thinking abilities. Productive disposition. A general view of mathematics is something useful that's part of everyday life, that's a powerful thing to have, a positive attitude towards it. And then adaptive reasoning, just the capacity of general thinking, logical thought, reflection, just being able to think among ourselves, within ourselves, and to reason with other people. So those are the 5 intertwined threads that the NRC put forward. And these are the 5 principles that I take as a starting point when I think about developing video games for mathematics education. The game needs to address all 5 of these. Most of the games that are available at the moment, the apps in the App Store and so forth, are focusing primarily on number 2, procedural fluency, which is fine. We need all sorts of things available to us, but that's just one of the 5 ingredients, and ideally a good video game should address all 5 together, not one at a time. Having said that, I will look ahead and say I am going to be focusing actually on apps for various reasons rather than single video games. And when you're talking about apps, educational goals emerge from a whole collection of apps. So by building individual apps, you can address the threads separately and regard a collection of apps together as providing the education. And as we go forward with video game development, people have been moving forward. We began by looking at, in my own work, I began by looking at video games, single-player video games or multiplayer video games with a single world, a sort of World of Warcraft type game. Looked at that for a while, then looked at sort of single-player games, then looked at apps. And I think we'll see the people move back and forth as we move forward. Okay. So that's the general background. I'm going to be focusing in particular on one obstacle to mathematics learning where video games, to my mind, have the hugest potential impact. There's something we can do with video games that we were not able to deal with before, and where the video game can have a very powerful impact. That one area is one of 4 obstacles, well-known obstacles. I've picked the obvious initials STEM, STEM as in STEM education, but as I think everyone in this room knows, there are 4 obstacles for mathematics learning. One is the symbol barrier. You may not have heard that phrase before, but you will know the concept. I actually invented that term. Maybe I wasn't the first person, but I started using that term about a year ago, largely to draw attention to the fact that it is a major problem and video games can actually address it. So that's what I'm going to be really focusing on. But the other problems are the transfer problem, taking knowledge that you've acquired, abilities you've acquired in one context and applying them in a different context. It's a huge problem that educators face all the time. It's a major problem in mathematics education. Engagement, keeping the students engaged, keeping the learner engaged. And then 2 M's, meaning and motivation. Okay, now, traditional approaches can, and very often do, fail on all 4 counts. It's for a whole variety of reasons. In a classroom with 20 or 30 children, it's actually hard to do any of these. It's hard to keep them all engaged. There's a whole bunch of problems. But certainly, although individual teachers, individual classes can address these and do frequently, by and large, I think we have to admit that those are failure points. Not for want of trying, just that these are difficult points. Video games, well-designed video games, can handle the last 2 quite easily. Video games are unbelievably engaging. We don't have to force kids to play video games. In fact, 97% of the children in our schools play video games for many hours a day, or several hours a day and many hours a week. So 97% of kids the world over that have access to video games, which is most kids these days, they play them. By the time they've graduated from high school, they'll have spent more time playing video games than they have in our classes, in all subjects. So we don't have to force kids to play video games. They find them engaging. So do 65-year-old college professors. I've spent many hours playing video games, and I might pretend that I play them because I'm studying them and building them, but the reality is the moment you start playing a video game, you better be prepared to lose many hours of your life because they suck you in. They're a theatrical experience. You have to begin by suspending disbelief and entering that world. But once you've entered that world, it grips you. And you'd better eat dinner before you go online because you're not going to eat for the next 6 hours. You're going to be totally engrossed. They're incredibly powerful and engaging environments. And they provide meaning and motivation. At the very least, within the context of a game, when you've suspended disbelief, everything you do has meaning and motivation within that game. Just as when you're in the movies or a good play or a good concert, once you're into the flow of the performance or of the movie, then you're engaged, you're motivated. It means something to you. Your emotions are involved. And as we all know, if you can involve emotions, learning is much better. And video games are powerful at engaging and involving our emotions. So that's just good video game design. They don't all succeed, but if the game is well designed, it handles those 2. That leaves 2 problems to focus on. Let me tell you what the symbol barrier is. Well, I'll tell you what each one is, and then I'm going to come back and focus on the symbol barrier. The symbol barrier is the name I've given to something that first became well known in the early 1990s when 3 researchers, 1 from the University of London and 2 from the University of Recife in Brazil, published a book called Street Mathematics and School Mathematics. And what they did was let me just tell you briefly what those scholars did. They went out into the marketplace in Recife in Brazil, posing as shoppers. And in their bags and their pockets, they carried tape recorders. And they went up to stalls that were being staffed by young children. Children between the ages of 8 and 14 who were looking after the market stall while their parents were away temporarily. So these scholars who were dressed as shoppers would go up to the stalls and they would buy things. These kids didn't have calculators, by the way. They were going to deal with the transaction using mental arithmetic. So the 3 researchers going up as shoppers, tape recorders running, would start buying things. And occasionally they would make it difficult. They would buy 13 bananas and make it very difficult for the kids. And then they would pull out a large bill and say, I'm sorry, I don't have the change. So these kids were forced to figure out the prices and work out the change. And they did it in their heads, and they did it despite all of the noise and the bustle of the street market, and their accuracy was 98%. If you look at their book, or a book I wrote in 2000 called The Math Gene, where I take some of their results, you'll see transcripts of many of those transactions. A couple of things to note. Those kids were not using the mathematical methods they were learning and had learnt in the schools. They were using methods, efficient calculating methods that they had developed and picked up on the job helping their parents at the market stall. It used everything that we think is wonderful about doing arithmetic efficiently. They would estimate, they would round to the nearest multiple of 10 or 5. They would calculate, keep the answer in their head, make the adjustment back for the original estimation. They would use associativity, distributivity, commutativity. They just use very efficient methods to get to the right answer, knowing that division and subtraction are hard, so they would make sure that they were mostly adding and multiplying. Very sophisticated reasoning. And despite all the noise and the bustle, at great speed, they would hit 98% accuracy. That was the first part of the study. The second part of the study was these scholars, pretending to be shoppers, would wait till the parents came back to the stall. They would introduce themselves, and they would arrange to visit later on, either to the stall or preferably to the home of the subjects. They went into the homes mostly, and during the course of the next few minutes, or half hour or whatever, when they'd made the child feel at home and feel comfortable, they would ask that child to do a small written arithmetic test. The problems that they were being presented with numerically were exactly the problems they'd presented with in the marketplace. So here are the kids faced with a paper and pencil symbolic arithmetic quiz, on which the problems were problems which, in the noise and bustle of a marketplace, in their heads, the kids had scored 98%. There was no doubt the kids could do those problems, but the performance level, paper and pencil, was 37%. There's the symbol barrier. People can do arithmetic. Almost everyone can do it, unless you're one of the small percentage of people with a mental condition called dyscalculia. You can do it, and you can pick it up quickly. But if it's presented symbolically and abstractly, down drops that capacity from 98% accuracy to 37% accuracy. It makes a difference whether you're doing something in a meaningful, motivating, real-life context, or whether you're doing it in an abstract and decontextualized context. So we need to be aware that it's not that people are not numerous and have numerical ability, it's that they don't have the capacity to naturally and easily deal with something that's abstract and contextualized. So in terms of my nomenclature, I'm calling it everyday mathematics. Everyone can do it. The question is, what happens when it becomes symbolic? And the answer to that question is they can't do it. So symbolic representations of the problems, that's the symbol barrier, and that's the sweet spot where we can use video games to really make a difference that wasn't available in Euclid's time. Okay, I'll come back to that because that is the main focus of the talk, but I need to just tell you about how we're dealing with the transfer problem. And there are various ways of dealing with this if you're looking at video game pedagogy. One is to develop video games in which right from the beginning you're using abstract representations, because one of the powers of abstract representations is it does provide a bridge for transfer. It's difficult, and we know it's a challenge. We've already seen from Recife, from the street mathematics results, that it's a challenging issue. But if you can develop an approach in a video game where symbols are around from the very beginning, but those symbols are endowed with meaning, so you can get by the symbol barrier, then you're already well on the way to transfer. And here are screenshots from two current video games. One called Dimension M came out a few years ago. This is a high school game, came out of a couple of high school teachers in New York City first developed this. It's what's known as a first-person shooter. You're an agent trying to negotiate around an island to perform missions, and you're presented with these head-up displays of mathematics that you have to solve to deal with things. This is a very recent one. It's a game it is actually released. A small group of people, a math teacher in Taos, New Mexico, brought this one out. It's not a finished product yet, but it's a very ambitious project, and I like this one a lot. It's called Coe's Journey. What he did was it's set in the American Southwest, Native American sort of folklore. cowboys and Indians kind of thing. And there's a young princess called Ko who has to find her way around using trigonometry, mixing her own herbs, making her own food, so she's faced, and she has a book. She has this little book in which there are recipes for doing things, instructions for navigating by the stars. So what the developer has done is create an entire world in which mathematics arises naturally, in exactly the way it did historically. You know, geometry and trigonometry arose because people wanted to navigate. So he's created a world where you can go back into medieval times and navigate. I mean, historically, it's not set in medieval times, but it's taking you back to the origins of mathematics, taking it back to the time when you had to measure things out yourself and mix herbs and potions and things. And he's picked a story that many people find very compelling. I mean, for one thing, it's a gender-neutral story. And so it's not a game that predominantly appeals to sort of young male adolescents or something like that. Okay. That's an important issue. If you want to do this kind of thing, if you don't want to get the symbols in the way, if you don't want to hit this problem of abstraction, you need to build the world so that things arise naturally. Start with the mathematics and then develop the game. People have said, why can't we take a video game that's already out there, that's past its shelf life, and build some mathematics in? Well, you can to some extent. But it won't work as well as if you begin with the mathematics and build the entire world around it, because what you want is for that mathematics to arise naturally. You want your learner to be just like the child in the street market in Recife. That child actually was not dealing with numbers and arithmetic. That child was dealing with coconuts and bananas and money. And that child was motivated because that child was looking after their parents' market stall, which was their very livelihood. It doesn't get much more meaningful and motivated than being in charge of your family's main source of income. And if you can use a video game to to simulate something like that, then you at least have a chance of achieving the results that were observed in Recife. So make it so that the mathematics is natural and meaningful. You know, we claim to our students that, with justification, that mathematics arose historically to deal with problems in the world, which it did. So we should be teaching it that way. We should be helping them to learn by making it clear how it's grounded in the real world. And the second thing is make sure that the player in the game sees themselves as a practitioner. As we all know, 90% of what it takes to learn mathematics is believing in yourself. It's like skiing, right? If you have confidence that you're going to be able to ski down that slope, the chances are pretty high that you will. The moment you lose that confidence on that tricky turn 2/3 down, you fall. Right? It's about confidence. The same with riding a bicycle. The moment you are confident you can ride a bicycle, you can ride a bicycle. If you can create an environment where the mathematics is natural and the person sees themselves as a mathematically able person, then you're 90% on the way to being able to produce someone who can do it. And it doesn't have to be your identity. The nice thing about video games, this kind, is you create an identity and then you move into it. You are this person, you're in that person's character, and you see that as a mathematically able person. So these are good pedagogies, and they will help you towards the transfer problem. I adopt a different principle. I started a small company about a year ago, which we call Euclid, which is trying to build some different types of games, and we adopted a different principle. We said there are two domains. There's the video game domain, and there's the learning domain in mathematics. In other words, we're thinking of building apps for use in the classroom or the home, but our approach is going to be, we'll keep the video games, and we'll let the teachers do the teachers, but we'll build the games in such a way that they interact. And so the view we're taking is, you meet a topic in mathematics, the first thing the child does is simply play a game, an app, in which you develop some reasoning skills. It's not explicitly mathematical. I mean, the child may well, we're not hiding the fact it's mathematical, but there's no traditional mathematics, there's no symbols around. You're just manipulating objects, you're doing things, but underneath those objects there are mathematical concepts. So you play for a while, and it's playful learning. You know, play is learning. That's what play arose for historically, evolutionary terms. It's a learning process. As you progress through the game, it gets harder and harder. And eventually you have to ask your friends or your family or your aunts or your uncle, or you have to go on the web. You have to find some extra resources to get through some levels. The level at which this happens will vary from child to child. The thing about video games is it's personalized. That game engine can track your progress, and some children will be moved very quickly through, and others will take longer, or it'll be a slow process. But you can adjust the rate of learning to each individual child. But there will come a time when none of these resources are going to be able to help, unless the child has a math teacher as a parent, and then the child will have to go to ask the teacher. Learn what's behind it, acquire that skill more abstractly, and then feed back into the cycle. So our view is there's a familiar video game learning cycle, but we're putting a teacher in the middle of it. That means the teacher, although separate from the game, essentially becomes part of the game. It's just a different conception. The reason we're doing that is because of the suspension of disbelief issue. When you're in a video game, I think it's important to feel as if you're in a video game. The moment mathematical symbols appear in that game, you're reminded that you're actually in a math class. And for many kids, that's not a problem. But as we all know, there are other kids who really have a problem with mathematics class. So my view is if we can keep it not looking like a math, if it can look like any other game app, then we'll probably keep more kids in. But these are early days. You know, things will almost certainly change as we build more of these things. Okay, so the view my colleagues and I are adopting is let the teacher deal with the things that teachers are well suited for, and let the game do the things that the game are well suited for. And that means I don't need to talk about that anymore because I've left that to the teachers. As someone trying to develop a game, I've very smartly removed a difficult problem and left it to an expert, namely a teacher, and I'm going to focus on dealing with the symbol barrier within games. Okay, so here's the problem we're faced with. People have ability when it's in a meaningful, real-world context, presented with what's, in some sense, the same mathematics on a paper and pencil, they don't do as well. Faced with this evidence, the question is, how should we be teaching this material? Well, right now, what we do is we put people in that kind of an environment, although the goal is that they use mathematics in the real world. Remember, this is everyday mathematics. I'm talking about everyday life skills. Preparing people for science and engineering careers is something different. My goal here, and especially using video games, a technology that reaches 97% of the kids, we should be focusing on the stuff that everybody needs to know. That's the really important target we can do, we can go for. Okay. If we teach by using that as a method, we're not going to achieve the goal of having everyone able to do this, even though everyone has the capacity to do that. This is like taking a funnel and pouring water into it. If you have the funnel the right way up and you pour water in it, it all comes through. If you turn the funnel upside down, an awful lot of water spills over the side. We are taking the funnel in the wrong direction. This is the wide end of the funnel. What we should be doing is taking this as the primary form of education, put all the children in the wide end of the funnel. They can all master this, and they need to master it. And some of them will master that. We're going to lose a lot of students that just for whatever reason, either don't like or don't achieve that. But a couple of things will happen. First of all, we won't have lost everybody before they've mastered this. And what we want to be doing is making sure that everybody leaves our schools mastering everyday numerical cognitive skills. We want some kids, as many as possible, to master abstract mathematical skills. But as we all know, if people have a grounding in a real-world context, that can form the basis for learning that. So two things would happen. First of all, we wouldn't lose a lot of people before they've learnt the stuff that matters. And almost certainly we'll have greater success at getting people able to do that, because that learning can be grounded in real-life experiences. Of course, one way you could do this would be to make every child look after a market stall for a while and then do various other things. I mean, that just deals with some skills. You would need to do other things. Kids would have to do some orientation or navigation to learn trigonometric skills or whatever. But, you know, one thing you could do is put people in real-life context for a few weeks, but that's impractical for a whole variety of reasons, and it would take a lot of time. The reason we're going to come bringing in video games next is because you can simulate these in a way that anything like that you can simulate in a game and provide that in the comfort of people's own homes. Okay. That's what we should be doing. We should be basing our education on real-world type experiences or simulated real-world experiences, and then developing the symbolic mathematics from that. So the question is, why are we not doing that? This is not rocket science if it's so obvious. Well, we haven't had the ability. We've got first of all, we've got habituated to the fact that mathematics is a certain kind of activity. And in large part, that's because we haven't had the right medium. If you go out and you ask people, and there's been many studies like this, you ask people to describe a mathematician, or to pick out, you know, show people 20 photographs and say, which one do you think's most likely the mathematician? You're going to get an image something like this. Our friend Albert Einstein. This is the stereotypical mathematician. Male, wiry hair, rumpled sweater, not particularly concerned about his appearance. Those are all sort of iconic images that come to mind. The key one, however, is what's going on at the bottom. Paper and pencil. If you're a movie director like Ron Howard or whatever, and you're making a movie, and if in that single establishment shot where the character first appears, if you want the audience to know instantly that that person is a mathematician, that's what you do. You show them writing symbols. And the reason Hollywood does that is they know it works. That tells you at the first glance, that's a mathematician. We associate mathematics with doing symbolic manipulations. All of us do that. We just default to that. We also default to the fact it's male, and I found the only image on the web available in where I found a female. Why do we do that? Well, in large part because mathematics, although it wasn't given to us in stone tablets, it was given to us on clay tablets. From the very beginning of mathematics, it's been presented to us in terms of symbols on flat two-dimensional surfaces. We're talking 5,000 or 6,000 years now. So for 5,000 or 6,000 years, mathematics has been presented to us as symbols on a flat surface. And after 5,000 years, we've come to believe that that's what mathematics is. But it's not. That's a representation. It's just a way of recording it. Unfortunately, it's been around so long that we've now really got used to the fact that mathematics comes delivered to us in units called books. That's what we buy. If we want to get hold of some mathematical information, we buy a book. Been doing that for a long time, 2,000 years. But it's a technological limitation. That was the only technology we had. If you wanted to store mathematical information and distribute it to everybody in the world, that was all you had available. You wrote books. If you look at the spread of mathematics, modern mathematics, with the Hindu-Arabic arithmetic, beginning down in India in the first 6th or 7th centuries, coming up through the Arabic-speaking world in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, crossing the Mediterranean to Italy in the 13th century, moving through Italy, it was all done by writing books. Greek books, Arabic books, Latin books, Italian books. It was all spread by books. Books and written medium. That was how it spread. That was how people first engaged it. That's how they discovered it. That's how they learnt it. But that was the technology. The best technology we had was to write books and spread them. But already that's a problem, because mathematics is it's something you think. It's an action. You do mathematics. Mathematics isn't something you know, right? It's something you do. So you're capturing something that you do. You're capturing an action in static symbols on a page, which means you've already lost an awful lot. Go back, I mentioned Euclid already. Look at what Euclid says. He tells you to perform actions. Draw the perpendicular. Draw this arc. It's all actions you carry out in your mind. But after 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years, it's hard to separate the mathematics from its representation. But it is it's something you do. Mathematics is like golf or tennis or riding a bicycle. It's something you do and you learn to do. It's not facts that you know. Everyday mathematics, the stuff I'm focusing on, it's not just something you do, it's something you do in the world and about the world. It's fundamentally an action in the world. I made the point before that that's a little bit different from advanced mathematics. In fact, it's a big difference between advanced mathematics. That is a different issue. But everyday mathematics is an action performed in the world. All mathematics is an action, but everyday mathematics, the symbols are just a convenience. They're not an essential part of it. And if they're not an essential part of it, why are we teaching using them? And a bigger question that arises, as soon as you get to that point, is this one. What is the goal of teaching mathematics? Or what is the goal of helping people to learn mathematics? Well, there's two possibilities. There's one which I think most people would assume, and certainly most parents in the United States assume, is that the goal of mathematical learning is to acquire a bunch of skills and abilities, definitions, facts, rules, representations, methods, algorithms, formulas. It's the stuff of the regular math class. And for many generations, that was actually important. But in an era where we have ubiquitous computing devices that can do almost anything we want, this Macintosh sitting here could get a degree in mathematics at any university. It has the power to pass the exams in almost any course in mathematics with at least a grade B. Okay, so we have machines that can do all of that stuff. What we don't have are machines that can think analytically and in creative ways and put things together and think analogically as well as logically. We don't have machines that even come close to doing deep mathematical thinking. To develop a habit of the mind that approaches a problem in a way that may or may not be mathematical, but when it becomes mathematical, can be made mathematical. I would say in the 21st century, especially in the Western world, the advanced countries, that's where we need to be focusing, on the things that are uniquely human. We need to accept the fact that we have machines that do things that were important. I mean, it's a salutary observation that everything I learned in high school and at university, all of that stuff is no longer a uniquely marketable skill. For a while, I made money by selling my skills as a mathematician. But all of the actual material I learned is no longer an important marketable skill. I'm left with one thing that's invaluable. That's being able to think about a problem in a certain way. But the actual methods I learned about solving simultaneous linear equations, differential equations. I learned a whole bunch of techniques at university. None of those make me stand out anymore. You can do it on machines. You can outsource it. The world has changed. We need to move on with the change. And I think we should be focusing on mathematical thinking, a particular way of thinking about problems. And yet, we're still very largely in a world dominated by an educational system that goes back to the monasteries in medieval times, of people learning in classrooms. Fortunately, we see classes far less like that these days. But the image here, by the way, is a book, a 13th century handwritten manuscript of an arithmetic text out of Italy in Italian, a child's exercise book. I actually held that in my hand last summer. It's very nice to hold a 13th century book in your hand and realize that that was one of the books that was part of the spread of arithmetic and the creation of the modern financial and commercial world. But that book in the contents of that book differ very little from the contents of a modern arithmetic or mathematics textbook. It hasn't changed much in hundreds of years. Jump ahead to one of the hot topics today, Khan Academy. Khan Academy does a lot of stuff that's been very useful. Millions of people are benefiting from Khan Academy. It's a, it's a non-profit free service offered by a friend of mine in California called Salman Khan, getting a lot of attention, which is good. But it's also been touted as a remarkable new way of teaching mathematics. No, it's not. He's taken books and put them on YouTube. That turns out to be a significant advance. A lot of people have benefited from taking textbooks and putting them on YouTube. But that's just a different representation. He's just moved the medium. He's taken textbook instructional pedagogy and put it on YouTube. Significant advance, benefits a lot of people, but it's not a revolution. Nor is this a revolution. Taking video games and using them to provide an entertaining environment in which you can practice basic skills. But most of these games, by the way, don't teach anything. They don't help you learn anything. They help you become faster recallers. You internalize stuff, you chunk it better, your retrieval time goes up, but it just is a method for practicing stuff that you've already learned. They work, actually. I played this once for a couple of hours, and it's kind of fun. It's one of the few games where I can perform at a better level than most kids, because I actually know my number bonds. But you play the game with a PC, you're in a monster comes out and you're in a cave, the monster comes out, it's got a multiplication sum on the chest, and you have to type in the answer. And if you type in the answer quickly enough, the monster dies and you go on, and if you're too slow, the monster kills you and you have to wait a bit. Okay, it's classic Northern European education, where you threaten the children with a ruler if they don't learn their facts. But it's kind of fun. And if you given that it's useful at some stage to learn your number bonds, a child can play this for a couple of hours, and they've done it. I mean, it takes that anguish away from doing that and gets it out of the way. That's all it claims to do, and in those domains, it does well. The obvious thing wrong with it in terms of a video game is you go into this world, and you're this is you, by the way, down at the bottom. You're in that world, and as you go into that world, you're faced with these monsters, and you are having this experience. But the moment that monster comes out with this on the chest, you're not in a video game world, you're in a math class. And when kids are asked about these games, what they say is, you can ask them two questions. Would you voluntarily play this video game? And the answer is no. The second is, how does it compare with the regular math class? Oh, much better. That's fine. You've got something that would be otherwise dull, and instead of the teacher having to take the flak, the video game takes the flak and the teacher can focus on something else. So if I was teaching kids that age, I would offload this issue onto a video game. But it's not a new pedagogy. It's just, well, obviously when you change the medium, the pedagogy changes, but it's basically just symbolic, instructional, information-based learning. Likewise with these guys. They add an awful lot in terms of context and meaning, but the mathematics is still being presented in a traditional way. These kind of games, I'm sure, will continue to develop. This is not a transient thing, I think. These are games that are going to be with us for some time. These kinds of games, they're going to get better and better, and that's one genre that's out. I'm going to be focusing for the rest of the talk on another genre, the one that I and my colleagues have been working with, which is going to be focusing on specifically the symbol barrier. Okay, and let me summarize where we are with the symbol barrier. Mathematics is not intrinsically about symbols, certainly everyday mathematics, which is my focus here. It's a way of thinking. All of mathematics is, everyday mathematics is a way of thinking about things in the world. It's something you do. It's an action. It's like golf, tennis, driving a car, riding a bicycle. And what's the best way to learn how to do something? Half the teenagers in the world have this essentially on their sneakers. You just do it. You learn by doing something, if it's something you do. If you want to learn how to play tennis, play golf, ski, play an instrument, play chess, drive a car, you don't read a book, you don't sit in a class, you go out and you do it. You take advantage of the fact that we as a species evolved to learn by experiences. We're the proverbial dog that continually can learn new tricks. That's arguably our unique survival skill, is that we learn from our experiences and we adapt according to that learning. And we don't have to work to do it. We cannot have an experience without learning from it. It's built into life. We carry our histories, we evolve our histories with us. So we're built to learn from experiences. For a few thousand years, we've had books and writing, and we've had a different way. But a few thousand years is a tiny drop in evolutionary time. So we've had hundreds of thousands of years where we've evolved to learn from experiences, and a few thousand years when we've had the ability to learn from written instructional materials. So learning by experience, if we can deliver it to someone, is much more powerful and much more lasting. Sometimes that's difficult to achieve because of danger or accessibility. And so more recently, we've learned how to build simulators in which you can fake experiences. So now if you want to learn how to fly in a modern aircraft, or if you want to go and learn to be an astronaut with NASA, or if you want to be in the US Army or any army and fight and be a soldier, or if you learn to be a brain surgeon, you go in a simulator. You may also sit in classes and read books and things. That hasn't gone away, but it's well known in many disciplines now, many domains, that the most effective way to learn something that you're going to be doing is to learn by doing. And taking everything I've said so far and drawing a conclusion, what we should be doing for mathematics education that will overcome the symbol barrier or circumvent the symbol barrier is throw the symbols away to one side, not forever, but to one side, and focus on the activity. Now you might imagine that I was about to say we should be building worlds in which mathematics is done. In fact, 5 or 6 years ago, I started a project in collaboration with a commercial video game company in Silicon Valley to do just that, to build a massively multiplayer online role-playing game in which mathematics was literally coming out of the walls. You could not turn without having to solve a mathematical problem. And we spent some years trying to build one of those things. And we actually built some prototypes. It does work. It's expensive and difficult, but it is doable. And I'm sure that there are companies and groups around the world still trying to, in fact, I know there are groups trying to do this kind of thing. It is kind of expensive. Building those devices, building those worlds is expensive, and maintaining them is expensive. My guess would be if you wanted to build a world like this is a game called Portal, which is a very interesting game, a strategy game, it's a thinking game. This is the nerds game. Nerds like this game. Computer engineers like this game. I love this game. Very challenging. But if you wanted to build one of those worlds, and it's mainly physics, but it's built mainly on physics and analytic problem solving. But if you wanted to build that kind of a world and embed a lot of mathematics in it, I would guess you'd better have a budget of about $10 million upwards. It's expensive. Well, that's actually, in terms of video games, that's cheap. But in terms of educational software, that's expensive. But it's a valid approach, and as I say, I know of groups that are trying to do that, and I'm sure there are other groups, and I'm sure we're going to see good examples of that. But there's another way to do it. The fact is you don't need that. 6 or 7 years ago, I thought you did need this. I thought you needed to build street markets in Recife and put kids in there and use everything about real, embedded, situated, contextual learning. That's what I thought. As we learnt more, as my colleagues and I went through that project, we realized and we discovered that if the interaction is well designed, you don't need all of that. In fact, you need almost none of that. The interaction takes over. It engages you, and so long as you're interacting, you're genuinely interacting, the rest of it really just blends away into the background. It just becomes wallpaper. Not only that, but it turns out that the embeddedness of the mathematics doesn't have to be in the world on that screen. The player of a video game is always in a real-world context. They're in a real world, a physical context and a social context, and whatever. They're part of a family, part of another group. They're already in a context. You can use whatever is on the screen to leverage that context. You don't have to build a complete world behind that screen in order to take that player in there. Good design can leverage in the real world and can leverage what's there. When you think about it, you've got a lot to play with a video game. You've got a world that you're creating, which can be simple or complex. You've got the world in which the player's in. And then you've got a middle ground of the player as an avatar or the player as controlling that world. You've got at least 3 identities, arguably a spectrum of identities, going from that player and that player's context into that video game world. And you can move back and forth along that spectrum in order to get the right kind of thinking and activities going on. So you can leverage those things. And some of the most successful video game companies around are actually doing that very, very effectively. They're leveraging real world and artificial world contexts. And as we learn more about using the medium, and all of the projects, even the commercial projects that are going on, they're experiments. This is all research. You know, I mean, there are companies out there making money doing this kind of thing, but it's essentially research as we learn how to do this. And the approach my colleagues and I have been taking, this is a choice. We made a choice a couple of years ago, to go in a certain direction, is that we're going to be building casual games. So a group of us now are actually designing casual games in the genre of Bubble Jump, Angry Birds, Bejeweled, or Sudoku, apps, individual apps that can be used to learn some mathematics. Now, if you've got an app just on an iPhone or an Android or whatever, that's a small screen, it's a small device. You're clearly, to get any good learning, you are going to have to leverage a lot of the user's context, a lot of the user's experience. And all the evidence that we've collected so far is that you can do an awful lot on that small screen. There's interesting identity issues. First of all, if someone's doing something on a small screen, it's part of them. They're not in that environment, that's part of their environment. So it's a dual of a large screen. Large screens and games with 3D worlds, if you're in a 3D world like World of Warcraft, you're actually in that world. You are a character in that world. You've got something in your hand, it's become part of you. But you've still got a lot of connection. It's either wraparound connection or you're wrapping around it. So you've got a lot of capabilities of engagement and motivation. It's part of you. That action is part of you. But as I said, this is a research project. It's a research project. And we started with one question. You might be surprised by this one, because we're talking about mathematics learning. We said, what's the best way to learn to play the piano? Do you learn by, first of all, mastering symbolic notation, practice for 10 years, pass the exams, and then we'll sit you down in front of an instrument? That's known as traditional mathematics instruction. Or do you start at a piano and start playing? Twinkle, twinkle, little star, or whatever, one finger at a time, and keep playing. Well, we all know what the answer is in terms of music. You learn to play an instrument by getting an instrument and getting someone to teach you and help you learn to play the instrument. And why does that work? Because the piano, which is not the music, it's an instrument on which you play music. It's an interface to music. Music really is something in your mind. It's an experience in your mind. It's an action. It's partly active, it's partly receptive, but it's in your mind. That piano is an interface. And boy, is that a good interface. You know, we think that the Apple Macintosh was a great interface to computing, and it was. It's nothing like as good as a piano to music. I mean, that is an incredible interface. Anyone who sits at a piano does not see themselves as playing the piano. They see themselves as playing music. It takes you right into the music instantly. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of time when you have to sort of get past the keys, but you're playing the music. You're right into the music in a very fundamental way. So let's just ask ourselves, what is it about the piano that makes it such a powerful way of learning music and learning to play music? First of all, you're doing the real thing. From the very beginning, you're at a real instrument, doing the real thing. You're not practicing for the world. You're already in the world. That piano, after you've finished your lesson, your twinkle, twinkle, little star, two-finger exercise, after you've done that, a concert pianist could come in and play Rachmaninoff on that same instrument. You're not learning to do something in the future. You're learning by doing it right now, and you're doing the real thing, not as well as that concert pianist, but you're doing it. It's the same device. It's not a toy piano, it's the real thing. You know when you sit down at a piano that you're at the beginning of a progression that can take you as far as you want to go. You're not going to have to change trains to get to the destination. You're on the train that will get you as far as you want to go. That's a great horizon. The connection is really direct. You're actually in the music. You can feel it. You can hear it. The feedback is instant. You hit the wrong note, you know it immediately. You don't have to wait till someone's graded your paper and sent it back. Your ears and the piano tells you, you've hit the wrong note. You might not know quite how you've hit it wrong. You might need a human being to help you, but you know it's wrong. The piano tells you it's wrong. It tells you how you're wrong. That note was too high, that note was too low, there was a mix. Again, you might well need a teacher, and especially as you get better, you will need a teacher, you'll need a coach to help you make finer distinctions. But even if the teacher or the instructor corrects you, that instructor is sitting next to you, is on your side. They're working with you. If there is, in many traditional educational settings, the student is against the teacher is the authority figure, the arbitrator of right and wrong, and you've set up an opposition. The child learning a piano, if there is an opponent, it's the piano. But the child knows the piano is just responding to the child's fingers. So you know where the blame is if anything's gone wrong. You just haven't got enough control of your fingers. And everything is designed to help you. So the instructor is the guide. And the piano gets adaptive learning correct. There's so much written about adaptive learning today. And what many people will take that to mean is that you have some AI behind the learning interface, and the AI adapts the delivery of what you're delivered to you. That's crazy design. If you've got a machine, even a modern computer, and you've got a human being, the human being is the adaptive one. Humans are endlessly and infinitely adaptable, and they adapt really quickly. Adaptive learning should be about providing a device that allows a human being to adapt to the situation. Adaptation should be on the part of the people. And the piano, it's the human being that adapts. You either slow down, you go back and practice again, you speed up, you adapt the degree of difficulty of tunes. If you've hit a tune that's too difficult for you, you go back and practice at a lower level. You don't go and buy a simpler piano. You change the way you're playing with it. You look at where the power is, and the power in human beings, and one of the powers is that we adapt. So this is why we began with the piano. We thought this was a great example of how to learn. The question would be, fill in the blank. Pianos are to musical notation as something is to mathematical notation. My colleagues and I are actually trying to build, and are building, apps that can fit in the bottom right-hand corner. I use the word apps in the plural. Turns out, at least our discovery has been, we have not been able to find a single instrument like a piano. The piano is very special in that you can use it to play almost any tune. It is a universal instrument. Our experience has been if we build an instrument on which you can play least common multiples or greatest common divisors, and we actually have built one of those, that's all it will play. So we've quickly found ourselves transitioning from building a few apps to building an orchestra. Okay, it's going to take an orchestra. So let's start building the apps, the instruments on which you can play mathematics, learning by playing, learning by practicing as you do the piano, and have enough apps to cover the curriculum. And we've actually built a bunch of these things. They're all in prototype form. The images here are just placeholder images. And we've got a bunch of these things. We've actually built about 10 or 12 of them. We've got another 20 or so in design. We're hoping to release them starting this year. Each one of them aligns to certain elements of the Common Core. The US has its Common Core curriculum, just as Sweden has a new mathematics curriculum. when you map these apps, and I'm talking about mine, but this will be true of any kind of apps. When you map these apps onto curriculum, the map is kind of weird. I mean, it's a many-to-many map. It takes actually several apps to cover one curriculum point, and each app typically covers many curriculum points, often over many grade levels. So these are the common core standards. We've applied for some funding to National Science Foundation for developing these, and so National Science Foundation wants us to align them to the common core standards, which we can do, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense, because all of the apps we've developed and are going to continue to develop, what they're really doing is mathematical thinking. They're all about mathematical thinking. Really what we did was the following. It was extremely simple. We have an interesting team of people, sadly an international team, with many people experts in mathematics and pedagogy, and of different types of pedagogical backgrounds. And we basically said, we've got a lot of knowledge, but we're going to put that to one side at the beginning. We're going to begin at the beginning and say, here's a technology. We can build apps that do things. We can build them quickly, not exactly cheaply, but we can certainly build them. Let's begin with what we can build, what the affordances are, and let's have a goal. The goal is the 5 standards of the NRC. Can we build a bunch of apps that when you've got them all, and it might take many years to get them all, but when you've got them all, you've covered all of the curriculum standards using those 5 points from the National Research Council. So we have a goal to build an orchestra that will provide all that's required. And instead of saying we want to use this methodology or that methodology, we'll say, here's the technology available. It's a new technology. Let's see how we can utilize that technology to its advantage to eventually reach that goal. In terms of traditional kinds of pedagogy, it's going to be like in a supermarket. We're going to take a bit of this, a bit of that. We're going to mix and match because it's a new world. It's a new game. It's a new way of doing it. We think it's important to begin and just work with what we've got and see how it goes. So when people say, what is your pedagogy? I'll say, we're making it up as we go along. That's a little bit fatuous. Of course, we're not making it up. We're taking advantage of everything that's been done over decades of research, but we're letting the medium dictate the way we do it. Every one of the things we've built is in terms of mathematical thinking, and we do look at the curriculum. We look at the Common Core, not because that's dictating what we do next, but simply because we know sooner or later we need to hit that point. And sooner or later we need that one. So as we start to develop our apps, we're looking at the different things that we need to do. But this kind of an educational tool doesn't map simply onto the Common Core. The Common Core is built on traditional pedagogies and traditional representations and text-based and symbolic-based representations. This is different, and I think we need to think of it in a different way. Okay, so I've got a dream. At the very end, my dream is this, that video games actually they do offer educators a tool. It's a supplementary tool. I always end with this because politicians with tight budgets have a habit of looking at technologies as a way of lowering the costs and maybe reducing the need for these expensive creatures called teachers. And I keep telling them, no, you're probably going to have to pay your teachers more because the teachers getting to be a really important issue here. These are supplementary materials. This is not replacing anything. This is another leg on the stool, but it's a leg that can overcome the symbol barrier. It's a tool we've never had before. We've never had it before, and we're only just beginning to learn how to make use of that tool. But we can use it to get around that 98% to 37% symbol barrier. I mean, we've built enough to see this in action. We've tested prototypes of apps with kids. We've seen that in action. We haven't got to the stage where we've got products out that we can compare. You know, the big comparative studies, that's down the line. That's what we applied to NSF to do comparative studies. But we've done little studies that have given us reason to think that this is going to work. And I think it can transform mathematics education, everyday mathematics. I think it can transform it. It can help elementary mathematics at the low level. It can help advanced mathematics. It can transform middle school mathematics in a fundamental way, and that's the bit we need to transform, because that's where we lose most of our students. And we can do it by hitting all of the 5 strands, because it's mathematical thinking. Again, if you're interested in the background, what I've said is work I've done since this book was written. This book was written 2 years ago, and the business with the apps is over the last 2 years, but the background behind what I've been talking about is in that book. And if you're interested in some of the specific details, my blog, one of a couple of blogs, one's for the Mathematical Association of America, but my own blog, the last 3 or 4 postings have been about this topic. So you can find some details about, specific details about what I've been talking about on that blog. And I'm going to keep on in that blog series. I'll be giving more details of this project that we're on the moment. Thank you. And now we've got time for questions, I guess, and there's a microphone. Someone has a microphone that they're bringing around, so if you have questions, not that I couldn't hear you, but we are, of course, recording this, so we'll need to use the microphone.
Well, thank you very much. Is it on? Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I'm very delighted with the things you're talking about, the apps. But I would like to ask a question, because when you wrote about the homework and that the students go home and do the new experiences at home, I have heard another mathematics educator doing the same thing in a project, and that was a woman from the Netherlands. Have you met her?
No, but
no?
That's...
It's very interesting.
Oh, yeah, it's a well-known method.
Yes,
so, exploratory learning, let the kids... I mean, it goes back also to the Davidoff curriculum in the Soviet Union, where you let kids play with things or questionnaire rods. I mean, yeah, the idea of beginning with play and beginning with embodied activities, that's, you know... we're actually not... You know, is the point I made at the end. We're not claiming to actually invent anything. We're saying we've got a new technology. Let's see how that enables us to use things that people have tried. We'll take a bit of that. We'll take some situated learning theory. We'll take some of this context. We'll just grab stuff we know and use the new technology. So we are actually technology driven. We're saying, for sure, this technology won't answer all of the problems, and there'll be things it can't do. Can we build apps that cover everything in the Common Core? I have no idea. I can make guesses. And of course, we're beginning on the things that we know look viable. We began with topics that are viable, and we're going to be putting off. You know, we begin with the low-hanging fruit. It's not clear whether you can cover all of middle school mathematics using apps. If I had to make a guess, I suspect you probably can. But because we're going to build on our experiences. From my perspective now, and I've been doing about this for 2 or 3 years, I can see a range of topics that I think, yeah, we can do that, and that, and my colleagues can think the same. When we get to that point, we'll be higher up the mountain, and I think the next step will look easier. Right now, some parts of mathematics, adding fractions looks really difficult to me. We have put off adding fractions because we can't find a little app that does it well. But after we've built a few others, that might just drop out.
I hope you succeed. And you're talking about middle school mathematics, and I think in Sweden it's the same thing. We lose a lot of students at that age. But I also think it has to do with the young, small children coming to school nowadays. They are used to iPads and computers, and we will lose them if we don't go into this kind of word, I would say.
And unfortunately, all of us in this room are in this awkward position of having grown up without these technologies as children, but our audience and our students have. And it's the classic, they're the digital natives, and we have the effort of getting into their world. And it's, that's my excuse for spending many hours playing video games.
You do. And I don't really have a question. I don't think so. Maybe someone else.
I wanted to know what it feels like to play right through World of Warcraft and to play Bejeweled to an insanely advanced level.
Yes, I have a son in grade 1, and he got some homework, and sometimes it's a video link. And some of those games, they are excellent. Some of them are really bad.
Yeah, they are.
So there needs to be spent a lot of information about what is a good tool or a good link, what is a bad link. Like what do they train and so on.
as you spend a lot of time in it, you develop a sense where you can, you just get better at evaluating them at first glance, although you can be misled. Sometimes games look, I won't mention any specific, sometimes games look as though they're really hopeless. But when you start to play them, you think, oh, there's something clever. In fact, at first glance, it's difficult to tell, and it's important that it's difficult to tell. One of the design principles we have in our project is that when a child picks up that, excuse me, when a child picks up that app and plays that game, it looks like and feels like any other game. That's important because we're trying to start where they are. They're in a world of video games. We want them to start with, this is familiar, this is known, and you play around. So first of all, the interface is obvious. It's just trial and error. You play with it, you get used to it, and then very gradually the challenges appear. Now, as those challenges appear, something is going to get more difficult. That's how all games work. In our games, the thing that gets more difficult because underneath it is some mathematics that's getting harder. Our goal is to keep the child engaged as they progress through that mathematical thinking. Now, sooner or later, as you go through, it becomes much more obvious that it's mathematically based. The kind of things you're dealing with are more overtly mathematical, at least from my perspective, because I know what's going on. But from the child's perspective, they're just having to think harder and harder, which means the design challenge for the game developer is to keep the engagement all the time they're getting difficult.
Yes, that's how they should work.
This is extremely expensive. Well, the people who are going to be really needed are what are known in the game world as level designers, the people who design the levels of the game. If you want to see an example of brilliant level design, it's Angry Birds. You know, that doesn't have millions of users by accident. That's an amazing piece of design for engaging. Not everybody likes it, but millions of people do. But that point is worth making. You pick any game and millions of people will like it, but not everybody will. Now, in the commercial video game world, if you've just got 2/3 of the market, that's fine. If you're building educational apps, 2/3 of the market's not acceptable. If you build a game that only the active male adolescents love, and you've missed most of the girls, you shouldn't be in business. I mean, you've got to make sure that you have, and in the case of apps, that means one of two things. You either build apps that appeal to almost everybody. Well, good luck, because I don't see how you're going to do that. Or, when you release apps so that you have 5 apps among which there's something that everybody will like. In the educational world, it's not acceptable to just build something that only some people like. You need to build things that everybody likes. Everyone needs an equal opportunity. And that's another challenge. I mean, there are some parts of mathematics where we can build apps, we've got ideas for apps, that will appeal to certain kinds of players. And then the challenge is, okay, but how do we deal with that mathematical topic for someone who's different? I mean, an obvious one is people who like to play on their own and people who like to collaborate. And collaborating with apps is interesting because you can do it in different ways. First of all, these are online games, so you can collaborate through the app. You can have kids distributed, sharing the same screen and doing things, or you can have kids around the same iPhone or the same iPad collaborating. We're only just beginning to think about how you, and literally not even do stuff, but we're just beginning to think, my team, about how people might collaborate with apps. We have no idea, well, we've got ideas, but we don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, I have a question about that collaboration part. When you play a video game, like if you play Angry Birds, then after time you proceed through the levels and then you get stuck and you have these birds and you have these stones which you aim with this thing and you want to destroy the pig's castle. And after a while I have to cheat. I have to go to the web page and see how can I go through this and to destroy it. And then I don't really solve the problem. I don't deal with the problem itself. So what I was thinking about these math-oriented apps, how do you design them so that when the kids collaborate, they are collaborating not to go skip the mathematics, but instead to engage in the mathematics. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So that they just don't do it without dealing with mathematics. They are kind of cheating.
Well, I'm going to give several answers. First of all, what you described, you actually did solve the problem. You solved it in an interesting way. You solved it by collaborating with others, by looking at resources that are available, which is an important life skill. Okay, so first of all, you solved the problem. You definitely solved it, and you solved it collaboratively. Okay, you know, I can solve problems with my automobile. I take it into the shop and they fix it for me. And life is specialized. So first of all, you solved the problem. I mean, I know why you were describing the question the way you were, because we're talking about basic thinking abilities that people need. Now, first of all, I think it's not important if one particular stage people solve it by looking something up, going on Google, and then later on they're faced with something that they solve themselves. So part of it is using the facility. Remember that my circular chart, it involved friends, family and all that thing. I think that's fine. Use those resources because they're part of important life skills. In terms of a particular piece of mathematics, I'd have difficulty defending the crucial importance of people knowing one specific piece of mathematics. I've managed fine for about 40 years in mathematics, putting off some things indefinitely, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you reach a problem and think, there's no one to help me, I'm just going to have to master this thing. And that's also part of life skills. So if you take, remember I said I'm taking a holistic view. At the end of 5 years, they'll have got a whole swathe of mathematical thinking ability. Within that picture, someone missing one bit, I don't think that's a big deal. I really don't think that's a big deal. And if it becomes a big deal for someone, at that moment when it becomes a big deal for them, they're going to have to solve it. By then, I would hope that they've had enough activities that they can go back and solve it. So I think the view, and I say think because this is research. I think the point is that we shouldn't get too hung up upon one particular little bit. Now, the other issue is, what about the kid who just lets their elder sister or brother do everything? Well, we've had that problem with us for hundreds of years, right? So we are actually not worrying, or at least I'm not worrying, some of my colleagues might, about forcing people through every particular thing. In fact, I think it's important not to, because you can really get hung up for hours on those things. And I do, when the going gets tough in Angry Birds or even more in World of Warcraft, I did the same. On the other hand, not only is that a useful life skill to know how to do it, but then you're learning from your friends. If you ask your friend something, well, for sure, that friend has learned something by teaching you. And you've learned something from your friend.
Yeah, but my question was not that it is bad to ask for
help.
No, that is really good. My interest was whether to what extent they are discussing mathematics or how to just go through the game. That was. But I agree that. No, actually, because there's a big issue here. In fact, my last blog entry went back to this famous 1973 paper by Erlanger on Benny's rules. You've got a game, and any game, one of our apps, and let's assume we have an app that does some mathematical topic, and a player goes all the way through and they score high marks. And we've got the data because it's an online game and so on. The teacher has a data analytics, so the teacher sees on the screen that little Sally went through and solved this one very quickly and did all of the problems. What can we actually conclude? All we can conclude is that Sally got to the top level of that puzzle. Now, we designed the puzzle so that getting to the top level probably requires a certain lot of mathematical thinking. But how can we know that? If Sally's a very smart student, she might have found another way of solving the problem. In fact, one of the things that happened to us with the project I worked on before with the commercial video game company, one of the things we found was we'd produce what we thought was a really clever interaction that requires some deep mathematical thinking, conceptual thinking. And we'd put this in front of kids, and some kids would solve it. And then we'd ask them how they'd solved it. They'd found another way to solve it. They hadn't gone through the mathematics. No matter how much you design something, thinking
that the only way to solve it is to do certain mathematical thinking, that just reflects our conception of what's going on. That child is not approaching that game as a game. I mean, as mathematics. To us, it's a game that embodies mathematics. To the child who doesn't yet know the mathematics, it's just a game. And all they're going to try and do is solve the game. Now, we can design the game so that solving it probably requires mathematics, but you can't be sure. And so, who can find out? That's the teacher. And as we all know, it's very difficult to find out how kids go wrong. So, another reason why we have that teacher in that loop, and we want to force the child to go to the teacher to solve the game, because the child is simply trying to get through the game. We want that child to, at some point, go to the teacher, because I don't see any other way of having a check in the system whereby we have some way of knowing whether the child is doing what we want the child to do. Are they learning some mathematics, or are they learning simply how to solve that particular game in a particular way, and it's just a one-off trick that they've learned? And that's, I don't know of any AI system that can solve that, and nobody else does either. This is this famous, this is the 1973 Benny's rules. That was a while, if you're familiar with that paper, I'm sure many of you are. It was the individually programmed instruction, and they took one. Benny was a young child who scored really highly. He progressed through these programmed exercises. This was paper and pencil things, but it was a programmed system without teacher intervention. Progressed through fast, scored the 80% level to progress to the next level, and then when he was interviewed, he hadn't got any mathematical understanding. He'd built an elaborate mental model of this game involving these symbols, and it got him all the way through, but he'd learned no mathematics. That's always going to be a danger with any kind of technology, and if you take the human being out of that technological loop, it's going to be very hard to conclude that the child who's done well in the game has actually learned anything useful outside that game. Okay, that's a very long answer, but I can't give short answers. Just built that way.
Perhaps there are no short answers.
No, actually there aren't. I mean, in fact, if I sound like an expert, that's a complete misapprehension. I'm someone who's trying to understand what's going on. This is so new. There are no experts.
And that's the expert view.
Yeah, there's no experts. It's all questions.
All questions.
It's all questions.
Unfortunately, we have to stop now, but I would like to give you a big hand for this excellent lecture.